It's good to see you tonight. Thankful again for this opportunity. We have for some time been looking at some lessons from the Song of Solomon, and we have reached that near ending, at least, of the text itself and of our study. We are ready tonight to look at chapter 8. I'm not going to do a lot of review. The lessons have been recorded, and I do submit that I'd be glad if you wanted to look back on a lesson if you missed one and then give me your feedback on it. But in chapter 8, we sort of see this beautiful reunion as the book comes to a close. If we'll go back just a little bit in chapter 7. As I read the book, at least, I think chapter 7 is Solomon's last effort to convince this woman to be his. And it's a pretty strong effort on his part, very forward, as he looks to make this Shulamite a part of his harem, a part of his people. And he's very forward in his talk with her. Verse 9 of the 7th chapter, the roof of thy mouth is like the best wine. But it is the Shulamite who I think interrupts him, and not in a friendly way, to say, yes, for my beloved. That's who it's for. There's sweetness there for my beloved, and that's not Solomon. Verse 10, I think, hints to that, as we've seen all along, because I am my beloved, and and his desire is toward me. Solomon had a lot of women. From early on, there were many. As I read the book, again, back over in chapter 6, where Solomon thinks he's complimenting her by saying that she's special. There are 80 queens and 80 concubines and virgins without number. But you're special. And I'd like to make you number 141. She declines that offer and does so with great firmness, though she's been offered time and again and again. And so when we see in chapter 8 this picture of these two leaning upon each other, I think by this point in time she has been released from Solomon's control and now makes her way back. Verse 5 of chapter 8, who is this that comes up from the wilderness, leaning upon her beloved? I think the couple has been reunited, and the book is ready then to draw to a close. These great words in verse 6 of chapter 8 we looked at last week. Set me as a seal upon thine heart. Here's the idea of a stamp, an impress. Those seals were used to mark ownership and authenticity. And here I think the idea is, my heart belongs to you, yours belongs to me. That's the kind of love these two had. That's a love that Solomon never knew. Again, as I read the book, I think Solomon, for some time, by the way, I don't think we talked about this last time, but the timing in the book is difficult to be certain about. In other words, we read this song and it's written not as a narrative in the sense that, okay, on April the 2nd, this happened, and then by April 14th, this happened. But you see these glimpses, images, sometimes going back and forth in the book. And the question is asked sometimes by students of the book, how much time passes in this book? And that's an interesting question. And maybe one of the small hints that we have might be found here in chapter 7, where after she proclaims her love for her beloved, and she's not willing to submit to the king's advances, she says, come, my beloved, verse 11 of chapter 7, let us go forth into the field, let us lodge in the villages, let us get up early to the vineyards and see if the vine flourish and the tender grapes appear and the pomegranates bud forth, and I will give thee my love. I think what she's describing here is the springtime when the plants began to bud. This is the time of year. You know, we had seen a reference to that earlier in the book. I think it's over in chapter 2. They are at this point divided. And you remember how that she seems almost in a dream or in a remembrance at least to speak to her beloved. And the beloved speaks to her, in which in verse 10 of chapter 2, the beloved speaks and says, "Rise up, my love, my fair one, come away, for the winter is past, and the rain is gone, and the flowers appear on the earth." He's describing springtime. And he's longing for reunion with her. And she likewise, in verse 17 of that chapter, pleased with him to be like a rower, a young hart, upon the mountains of Bethor, upon the mountains of division. May that bridge be, that distance be bridged. May that gap be closed. But that happens in the spring. So here's the point. Students of the book would say, okay, you find springtime when they were divided, and springtime as they are united. Couple of choices. Either maybe that's a year apart, or maybe it's the same spring. I rather think it's the latter. I don't think the events that are taking place, this tug of war, go on for a long time. I can see this happening in a few days or weeks, not months or maybe even a year or so. So that's at least a thought for whatever it might be worth to you. I think that this was wrapped up within a period of time when Solomon was intrigued, infatuated, obsessed with this woman. But as she rejected him and he was not willing to force her, he simply let her free, thinking, I'm sure, well, this girl's foolish. But then in his old age, writing the Song of Solomon about those earlier days, looks back and realizes she wasn't the foolish one, I was. Because this woman and her beloved knew something about love and marriage that Solomon never did know in practical terms. Solomon had a lot of women. He could write wise things. But he never in his life knew what a marriage really was, or as God designed it. That's what I think the book's about. And that's likely the timing of it. More short period, maybe within the same season, not a year or two of time. Let me go back to chapter 8. It's something we looked at last time. Set me as a seal upon thine heart, verse 6. And this is really this great memorable language of the book, as memorable as anything in the book, it seems to me. Verse 6 reads, love is strong as death, jealousy is cruel as the grave. Cruel in the old translation may be translated in yours as unrelenting. That's a great way to say that. You know, Sheol just never gives up. It just takes one and another and another. That unrelenting nature is the way she sees love. This is not some temporary, momentary feeling. This is something that goes down to the core of an individual. It is a most vehement flame, as we pointed out, I believe, last time. Actually, literally, the word could be translated, the phrase, the flame of Yah, the flame of Jehovah. And so this is like the flame of God. It is possessive. It is deep. It is abiding. It is strong as anything. Many waters, verse 7, cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it. If a man tried to buy it, he'd be held in contempt. You can't buy it. You can't quench it. It is a force, a power, real love. Not infatuation, not mere lust, but love as these two people knew it, as God intended it to be. What a great way to end the book. So now in verse 8, in the old translation, we find these words. We have a little sister. She hath no breast. What shall we do for our sister in the day when she shall be spoken for? Of course, this is going back, I think, to the brothers who are speaking here. Now, you remember early in the book, back in the very first chapter, one of the first scenes in the book seems to picture the Shulamite as she's been brought into the company of these women of the harem. I think that's who the daughters of Jerusalem are. And she feels very much out of place. She is out of place. She's out of place because here are these women who have sort of been brought up and have been schooled and have been pointing toward being a part of this crowd of the royal house. And here is the Shulamite, who's a beautiful woman and a smart woman and a lot of great qualities, but she spent her time outside working in the garden. She doesn't look like they do. And so that's when you remember she says, don't look upon me because I'm sunburned and tanned by the sun. And she explains her background. This is chapter 1 and verse 6, you remember. My mother's children, that'd be her brothers, wouldn't it, were angry with me, and they made me the keeper of the vineyards, but mine own vineyard I have not kept. And we said then that she felt a little bit put upon. She feels like that she's been mistreated. That's not uncommon, by the way, in my experience, that young women tend to feel that way. Not always, but any of us can feel sorry for ourselves. But I think when the brothers speak here at the end of the book, we see a little different view of what's been going on. And maybe they didn't put her out there and demand that she work out there just to be mean to her. Maybe this was all a part of a larger plan that had her best interest in mind. So we have this little sister, prepubescent girl, but we're looking for the day when she's going to be a full-grown woman. And what kind of woman will she be? That's the question. So verse 9 of our text. If she be a wall, we will build upon her a palace of silver. And if she be a door, we will enclose her with boards of cedar. Well, I don't think it takes a lot of imagination to understand what they're talking about. You've got two different ways you can go here. And she may grow up to be a wall. Well, what would that suggest? A wall is a barrier. A wall involves perhaps protection, security, that which prevents access. That's what a wall does. And so in terms of her person, in terms of her morality, she has standards. On the other hand, she might grow up potentially to be a door. We see the point there as well, I think. Something that is easily accessible. Different commentators suggest light-minded and accessible to seduction. The Cambridge Bible reads, if she be ready to permit an enemy to pass her defenses, then they, the brothers, will fasten her up with a plank of cedar. The plank is to be of cedar because that wood is especially tough and indestructible. So I think we get the point. They're concerned about her moral education. And they're looking to try, again, where's the father in this picture? It seems evident he's died. He's referenced once, but he's never quoted. He doesn't seem to be involved in their life. The mother's there, the brothers are there, and they seem to be taking on the role now of the father in bringing up this girl. And what they want to do is to do her right by making sure that they help her preserve her purity. One fellow put it this way, in the days of her adolescence, they were concerned to protect her innocence and purity till she was of marriageable age. If she be a wall, meant she would be strong and virtuous and that no man would be able to seduce her. If she be a door, meant that she would be weak and easily entered as through a door by some seducer. So we understand the point. And they have tried, sometimes they've made it hard on her, but always with the idea in mind that she might grow up to be someone that could have self-respect as well as the respect of others. And I just make this point in passing. That's our choice. Every young man and every young woman can grow up to be virtuous. It's a choice. Nobody's born bad. And circumstances are not to blame. Our choices determine whether we're going to be a wall or a door. And certainly as we think about raising our children, let's have the courage to do what these brothers did. Even if our kids don't like it, you got to make the rules and watch over them and know what they're doing and know what's going on and just risk being disliked. Not to be simply a nuisance, but because it's your job, my job as a parent, to rear our children to be pure. We need to know where they are. We need to know what they're wearing. We need to know who they're with. We need to know what they think. We need to talk to them about circumstances, about what they're facing, what they might face. And whatever it takes to raise, in this case, a young woman who would be a wall, is well worth it. Well, the Shulamite is not a little girl anymore, and she's all grown up. And she proclaims here at the end of this book, I am a wall. Even after she's been taken into the custody of the king, even after he's been pressing her, she's still a wall. She maintains her purity. She's not forgotten who she is. She's not forgotten her responsibilities morally. And don't you love this expression? She says, verse 10, I am a wall. And she says, then I was in his eyes as one that found favor. There's a direct connection between her purity, her insistence on purity, and the fact that she is admired by the kind of young man that you would look for, that you would want. I wish I could just impress this point on every one of our young people, young men, young women especially. You will not draw the best kind of young man by giving off a vibe, an impression by the way you dress, by the way you talk, by the places you go, that you are impure. You know, young men who respect purity are going to be repulsed by that. And the people you don't want are going to be drawn to it. You don't have to dress like the world because everybody else is doing it. You don't have to do it. And if you do compromise yourself that way, you hurt yourself as well as others. She said, because I made the choice to be a wall in this language, then a man that I admire was drawn to me. Be that kind of person. Be that kind of person. We'll say more about that maybe later, or maybe one more lesson. But in the 8th chapter now in verse 11, I think it is the Shulamite who speaks. And she says, Solomon had a vineyard at Baal-Hamon, and he let out the vineyard unto keepers. Every one for the fruit thereof was to bring 1,000 pieces of silver. Solomon had a lot of vineyards, I imagine, a lot of places. He had them all over the country. He had some in Baal-Hamon. But then she says in verse 12, my vineyard, which is mine, is before me. Oh, Solomon must have 1,000, and those who keep the fruit, 200. What's she talking about here? First of all, I'm not sure exactly where Baal-Hamon was. I don't know that I've found anybody who's sure about where that particular point was. Most people think that Shulam and Shunem, if not the same, were near each other. That would be up in the southeastern part of that valley of Jezreel, fertile country. And so this likely was somewhere in that same area. It's not really important, is it? It's one of those vineyards that Solomon owned. And because she and her family had some land there, it would certainly have been within her knowledge. But she talks about how that Solomon may have owned the land. He may have had folks that worked for him and could pay to use the land. That's a nice business, especially for Solomon, maybe even for the workers in some ways. But she said, my vineyard is mine. I don't think she's talking about a piece of ground there. I think she's talking about her person. Solomon's got his vineyard, and these workers work that vineyard, but my vineyard is mine. I'm not for sale. Solomon tried to bribe her, to flatter her, to seduce her. At the end of the day, she stands tall. My vineyard is mine. That's a marvelous statement. And it really raises this question when you think about it. Who's the real rich person here? I like this. This is a quotation from the Expositor's Bible Commentary. I read a lot of stuff on song, and a lot of it wasn't very helpful to me. But occasionally you find a little quote that you thought, well, I wish I'd have said that. And this is a good little quote, I think, that expresses what I believe is the truth. Solomon is referred to again, but it seems clear that he is not the hero of the piece. The speaker, Shulamite, is contrasting their vineyard with that of Solomon's. Solomon's vineyard is large, fruitful, very impressive. It contains thousands of vines. It is a very extensive operation. But our hero and heroine are in a very different position. They are not unhappy. Their vineyard is theirs alone, and that's enough to satisfy. To possess one's beloved is enough. It is to be wealthy beyond measure. We've marveled at this before. When you read the Proverbs, which largely are the work of Solomon, it's amazing how Solomon could write so wisely and live so foolishly, isn't it? Didn't Solomon know? He should have known this. Well, a couple of passages come to mind very similar in thought. Proverbs 17 in verse 1. Better a dry crust with peace and quiet than my house to be full of feasting with strife. Boy, ain't it so? Solomon could write that. But Solomon made a lot of compromises in his life to have stuff that never could bring him happiness. Distract him for a minute. But he could never know the joy that this couple we're talking about had. Very similar point made in Proverbs 15, as we call it, verse 17. Better a small serving of vegetables with love than a fattened calf with hatred. Solomon knew a lot about those fatted calves. We've read before in the histories about his table and about all the multitude of animals every day that were sacrificed and prepared, feeding, no telling how many people, how much of it was thrown away. I'll tell you something else Solomon knew about. He knew about that strife. Can you imagine a household of 1,000 women? You think that's the place of peace and happiness? There'd be plenty of blame to go around that whole circle. Our Shulamite says, no thank you. And Solomon knew enough to know better than the choices that he made. Let me come to the last two verses now of Song. And again, some might see this as rather anticlimactic, you know. We've already mentioned that really I think the book sort of comes together. The apex of the book is found here in the latter part of 4 and the beginning of 5. That's the consummation. That's the great marriage of these two.
There's some water under the podium if you need it.
Appreciate that. Thank you. But I think this is still a great ending. It may not be the ending we were looking for with the marriage bells and the honeymoon and all that, but here we find, as we've seen earlier, the Shulamite, I think, has been released. She's back home. People rejoice. Who is this couple leaning together? Great. And then the last two verses. Thou that dwellest in the gardens, the companions hearken to thy voice, cause me to hear it. Then verse 14, in answer, I think. Make haste, my beloved, and be thou like a roe or to a young hart upon the mountains of spices. Because we've read this book so many times, that speaks to us in a way maybe it didn't the first time we read it. In the first place, I believe it is the beloved that speaks in verse 13. Thou that dwellest in the gardens. You've just been talking about her garden, you know. She had a literal garden, and that her person was a garden. But he says to her, the companions hearken to thy voice, cause me to hear it. People are so excited that she's home. And her friends and those that love them are just so thrilled to hear her voice. And he is too, by the way. And he says, cause me to hear it. Don't just talk to them. Talk to me. Let me hear your voice. I think back earlier in the book, very different circumstance. Back in chapter 2. We referred to this a moment ago. But she's so excited, not to see her beloved, but just to hear his voice. Chapter 2 and verse 8. They're apart physically, but she can hear him speak. The voice of my beloved, Behold, he leaps upon the mountains, skipping upon the hills. There are many mountains and hills between them. But she's so excited by his voice. And she says there in verse 17, until the day break and the shadows flee, turn, my beloved, and be thou like a roe or a young hart upon the mountains of Bethor. We said that Bethor doesn't seem to be a geographic location. The word Bethor means division. Maybe you have a footnote that says that. They are divided. Sometimes mountains are pictured as dividing lines. But she desires that he might, like one of those mountain goats, scale the mountains, bridge the division. But she longs and loves to hear his voice. Here we come to the end of the book, and we go right back to that scene. But now we look back, and it's very different. Now their voice is heard. Now he longs to hear the voice that the companions hear. He asks her to speak to him. Talk to me. I long to hear your voice. And then in verse 14, it's the Shulamite that speaks, because that word beloved is only used in reference by her to her beloved. Make haste, my beloved, be thou like a roe or a young hart upon the mountains of spices. Before he had been like a roe, a young hart, a deer, scaling these mountains that divide. Now the mountains are not mountains of division, but mountains of joy. And it's a glorious picture as these two start their life together. One fellow said the bridegroom calls upon the Shulamite to let his companions, his friends who have come to congratulate him on his bride's safe return, hear her voice. And then the familiar words of chapter 2 and verse 17, sing this song of victory. The mountains have been bridged, the division has been closed, and now the joys are ahead of them. What a great song. It's a song of songs, because it is a God-given picture of what marriage ought to be. I thought maybe in concluding, or at least in beginning the conclusion of this study, having best I can explain the text. And again, I've said too many times, there are smarter folks than me who do not agree with my understanding of the text. I'm offering this for your consideration. But it's the conclusion that I've come to. But having done that, I ask the question, what is this all about? What is the Song of Solomon for? And I hope the answer is clear enough. I believe the Song of Solomon is not a strict allegory just telling us about the church and Christ or God and the Jews, and that's all it is. There's no other real thing going on. I don't believe that. I believe it's about something very, very human, and that is the glory of romantic love as God designed it. I am my beloved and he is mine. I want to look at several points along that line about what it is that this book is for. In the first place, it's about helping us to understand that love as God designed it is a mutual and exclusive love. One fellow said, there is a joy to be discovered in such an exclusive relationship which cannot be experienced by those who believe that in this, as in all other things, variety is the spice of life. There are plenty of folks in the world who believe that. It's so boring to think about just being one person the rest of your life. Oh, the real joy, you just need to throw off those crazy old ideas, and you just need to go from one to the other to the other. You'll never find somebody like that who's done that. And you have to be a certain kind of person to do that, who will tell you when they get to be, a certain age, boy, I tell you, that's the life. They all wind up miserable. They all wind up broken. They all wind up burnt out, disillusioned. The Lord knew that. That's why he didn't prescribe that. He made marriage, and he made man, he made woman, and so it is in Matthew 19. When the Lord was asked a question about marriage and divorce, his response was, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. No more two, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. All these terms that have been invented by men, polygamy or polyamory, which is just serial fornication as best I can figure. The great truth was found in the description of the first marriage. It's not good that man should be alone. I will make a help, a companion suitable for him, a suitable match for him. And so he did. And so those two would be one, as God went on to say there. Monogamy, in fact, is the natural desire and need of men and women, despite the efforts of men to try everything under the sun except what God has recommended. People who've studied this make the point, even those who are not terribly religious, make the point that, men and women are made with the idea in mind of having a purpose to care for others. You can't be a husband to 1,000 wives. We're just not made that way. Nor can a wife feel security in a polygamous type relationship. There's a greater life expectancy, just a fact, from those who have long-term monogamous relationships as opposed to those who might live a more reckless lifestyle. The joys that you share in such relationships, and not to say the spiritual encouragement that you find in such relationships. And yet, marriage is less popular in our society, in our time, than it maybe has ever been. The marriage rates are lower now than they have ever been. Why is that? I think the answer to that is because people have believed that great lie. And the great lie is that slavery is freedom. It's not a new lie. It's been around a long time. You read the New Testament, you find this lie. You remember Peter, 2 Peter chapter 2, talked about those deceivers. And he said, these are wells without water. Excuse me. Clouds carried by a tempest, for whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever. They speak with great swelling words of emptiness, and they allure through the lust of the flesh, through lewdness, the ones who have actually escaped from those who live in error. How do you draw people back who've escaped from error? Well, you lie to them. These figures are great, aren't they? Wells without water. Back in the day before you had the ability to just go and turn your tap on and there's water, 24/7 all the time, nearly. When you had to go out to a well, or maybe you were traveling and had to find a well, had to find water. Imagine needing water and finding a well and then finding it dry and the disappointment that was there. Here's a farmer. He needs rain. He's waiting for those clouds and they finally come and then the wind just blows them by. Don't get a drop. That's the world. That's the world's lies. Always promising, this will make you happy. Just ignore God. Do what I tell you. You'll be happy. You never will be. Not for long. Solomon is the poster child for that fact. And Peter writes about it in the New Testament. They promise liberty, verse 19. They themselves are the slaves of corruption. You need to get away from this Bible and get to living. Just live. That's death. Paul said, a woman that lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. That's the truth. That's the lie that the devil persuades men of. Ignore the facts. Believe the lie. It's heartbreaking. Peter said about these same folks, they have eyes full of adultery. They cannot get enough of sin. They seduce unsteady souls and have had their hearts expertly trained in greed. He said they're doomed. They're doomed. There's nothing new about the new morality. It's the same old immorality. I'm going to take an opportunity to share with you an illustration of this point, a modern illustration from a book. I ran into a quote from this book, and I decided I would buy it and read it, and I did. It's a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, subtitled A New Guide to Sex in the 21st Century. It's written by a woman named Louise Perry. I would not recommend that you buy this book because this woman is not godly. Her language is sometimes crude, and she is not going to point you to God. In fact, it's very frustrating to me that she can see the problem, but she cannot is not willing to acknowledge the solution. But the one thing that I did get from this was it's an example, not of some kind of Campbellite preacher, but of a woman of the world who has spent a number of years, most of her 20s and early 30s, living this feminist life. And who's just come to a point in her life, this book was written just a few years ago, where she just recognized this has always been a lie. And she writes a book to try to warn young women. Don't be hoodwinked by this. One of the chapters of the book is entitled, Some Desires Are Bad. No kidding. But that's news to a lot of people in our world. And she notes the influence on generations of college-age women by cultural anthropologist and homosexual activist Gail Rubin. You may have never heard that name, but that's a very famous name in some circles. Just a despicable, lost deceiver, the very kind of person that Peter was writing about 2,000 years ago. This is how Ms. Perry describes this individual. Rubin is radical in her liberalism. She famously rejects the idea of good or bad sexual behavior, interpreting such moralizing as inherently oppressive. Can you imagine that? Somebody standing up before a college-age crowd and telling them there's no such thing as good or bad? There's no morals in reference to sex? In fact, she goes on to argue like this. In Western culture, sex is taken all too seriously. A person is not considered immoral, is not sent to prison, is not expelled from his or her family for enjoying spicy cuisine. What's her point? Some people have a taste for exotic food. Some people have exotic taste in this realm. There's no difference. I think I've heard that argument before. You remember 1 Corinthians chapter 6? When Paul is writing to Christians who are trying to hang on to morality in an extremely wicked world there in Corinth. And he tells them, there are people who will tell you meat's for the belly and the belly for meats. You know, there's nothing wrong. God gave you desire for food. Fulfill your desire. Desire for sex. Yeah, Paul said, yeah, we are made to eat food, but the body was not made for fornication. There's a difference in fornication and the marriage bed. This is the kind of obvious distinction that these people are not willing to acknowledge. The author goes on to say, sex has been disenchanted. That's a great way to put that. In the post-1960s West, leaving us with a society that ostensibly believes that sex means nothing. Sexual disenchantment is a natural consequence of the liberal privileging of freedom above everything else. That's the word, isn't it? That's still the word. We got to be free. And so morality goes out the window because we want to be free. It's just sex. Summarizes the sexual disenchantment idea perfectly, she says. But it's not actually true. This is her speaking. And we all know it, including the liberal feminists who spend so much energy on arguing it. Like Paul wrote in Romans 2,000 years ago, people who claim there is no God know better. They have to suppress the truth in order to believe and practice as they do. She goes on to say, this fact becomes clear when we look at the 21st century university campus, where the gospel of sexual liberation is preached the loudest, and sex weeks are the new norm, and other things I wouldn't even put on the chart here. Sexual perversions celebrated in universities all across the country. She continues, the rule they're taught is simple enough, I should say. With consent, anything goes. And she gives an example that I thought was worth repeating. It deals with a young woman, at the time at least, named Leah Fessler, who was a graduate student at a place called Middlebury College in Vermont. I was not familiar with this college. It's a liberal arts college, as you might guess. The tuition, I found out, is $70,000 a year, $35,000 a semester. So you can take your young daughter and $70,000 times 4 and send her up to Middlebury, where she will be indoctrinated. Look at that campus. You see the trees up there? You see the beautiful fall, the old buildings. Doesn't it look glorious? These people are in the business of poisoning the minds of young people hand over fist. It is awful. And they are not alone. This is the quote about Miss Fessler, who was the student that Perry was noting and commenting on. About this young woman, unwilling to commit to celibacy. That just drives me nuts. In other words, we're just not even thinking about the prospects of trying to be moral, be a wall. No. And by the way, this is one of the problems I have with Perry, because she is the same spirit. She can see clearly all these problems. But at one point in the book, she writes this: reverting to traditionalism doesn't solve the problem. The world in which we now live is very far removed from the world in which the ancient religious codes were formulated. Oh, really? Oh, really? It's just so sad and infuriating to me. These folks can see the wreck, but they just dismiss the answer. On the next page, she says, I can't pretend that this is an easy issue to resolve because, quote, how should we behave sexually, end quote, is really just another way of asking how should we behave. And after a millennia of effort, we are nowhere near reaching an agreement on the answer to that question. How about that? How blind can you be? But here's what she says in the next sentence. Nevertheless, here is my attempt at a contribution. We should treat our sexual partners with dignity. We should not regard other people as mere body parts to be enjoyed. We should aspire to love and mutuality. We should practice, or prioritize, I should say, virtue over desire. I don't even know where to start with that. We should. What does the word should mean in that sentence? To somebody who disregards God and who only thinks that we just make up morality as we go, you have no right to use the word should. Should relates to something above my will, your will, his will, her will. There's something right. There's something above us. There's a divine. There's no divine. There's no should. We should prioritize virtue. It's a meaningless word to these people. There is no such thing as virtue without God. There's no such thing as good without God. This is maddening. And this is the world that we live in. Now, let me quickly make this point before we close. Fessler, this young graduate student at this high-priced school, unwilling to commit to celibacy. Oh, that's just silly, old-fashioned thinking. She convinced herself that emotionless sex was the feminist thing to do, and she did her best to ignore her unhappiness. The worst thing for women at Middlebury were the pseudo-relationships. Fessler and her friends quietly admitted to each other that what they really wanted was true intimacy, public recognition of a relationship, a hand held in daylight. That's pretty pathetic, isn't it? Not even holding out for a marriage, a committed relationship, but no. I just wish that they would look at me when we weren't fornicating. I know this is blunt. This is the world we live in. And this is the messages that are bombarding our young people. And we need to understand the folks who are trying to convince us are holding an empty sack. They have nothing to offer but misery. I thought this was a sad line. This woman, this young student, wrote her senior year thesis on hookup culture. That's supposed to be a cute name for just the ugly idea of just living in fornication at this particular school. And of the straight women who participated, here are the non-homosexuals that participated in her survey and research, 100% of the interviewees stated a clear preference for a committed relationship. Not because it was right by the Bible, just because they're human beings who don't enjoy being used, being adored. That doesn't lead to happiness. That's why God said, don't do it. Ungodly human arrogance does not produce freedom. I believe that's so. So, toward the end of the book, one more quote. She writes, each individual woman will have to learn on her own the lie of the promise of sexual liberation. It was a lie all along. It's time at last to say so. I don't agree that you've got to find out on your own. I don't think you have to make the mistake. I don't think we have to grab the hot stove to figure out that it's not pleasant. I think we can learn without scars. And that's what God wants to do. He wants to save us from so much self-inflicted pain. This is the message that I want us to share, especially with our young folks here. I want you to know that the standards in this world of sexual conduct are so low, it's shameful to think about. And the world will look at you and your morals and standards and say, you're crazy. I'm here to tell you, you ain't crazy. They are. They're miserable. And they want you to be miserable. They've been deceived. I don't want you to be deceived. What I would say for all of us, whatever age and whatever subject, trust God. What was it that Moses told Israel so long ago concerning the law of God? I never can quote this properly, so let me read it and then we'll be through. It's Deuteronomy 6:24. The Lord gave us these statutes, these judgments, for our good always, that He might preserve us alive as it is this day. I believe that. I believe every precept in the Scripture is given for our good always. God's not trying to keep us from having fun. He's trying to save our soul. He's trying to save our mind. He's trying to save our spirit. God, help us to have the wisdom to submit to His will, to have that faith. It'll help us in many, many ways. I appreciate your kind attention. Please take your songbooks out if you care to. We'll turn to the song Brother Ken has selected. There's a great day coming. And there's nothing more important than you and I being ready for that day. If you're not, I plead with you, if we can help you in some way to come to God or come back to God, let us do that tonight. He longs to receive you. We long to help you. Let your wishes be known right now while we stand, while we sing.